The Korean Mafia boss caught a black single mother stealing baby food from his private warehouse, but when he heard her reason, the most feared man in the city froze in his tracks. The silence of the industrial distribution center was heavy, smelling of cold concrete and expensive plastic. Amidst the towering crates of premium imports, a single sharp sound echoed, the clink of a glass jar. Normally, anyone caught infiltrating Junseo Kang's territory would be dealt with before they could plead for mercy. But today, the man standing in the shadows didn't move. Junseo Kang stood like a statue, his slick black hair reflecting the dim overhead lights and his strong jawline set in a mask of lethal calm. Beneath his crisp white collar, the dragons and phoenixes of his heritage crawled up his neck in ink, tattoos that signaled a man who had seen everything and feared nothing. Yet as he looked at the woman pinned in his security team's flashlight beams, his calculating eyes held a flicker of something foreign. Shock. He was a man who controlled the city's shipping lanes, whose name made seasoned criminals bow, but he was currently paralyzed by the sight of Nia Carter. She was exhausted, her gentle face lined with the deep fatigue only a single mother knows, clutching her small, fragile baby in white clothes as if he were the only treasure in the world. In her trembling hand, she gripped a single jar of baby food like a weapon of war. Junseo's lead enforcer stepped forward, his hand moving toward his holster. "Sir, shall we remove her?" Junseo's voice, usually like gravel wrapped in velvet, was barely a whisper. "Wait." He had expected a thief looking for a payday or a rival spy. He had not expected a woman who looked at his wealth with nothing but righteous fury. Nia didn't see a billionaire or a syndicate head. She saw a man whose legitimate business was poisoning her neighborhood. 10 rows back, she had heard the news of infants falling sick from his company's tainted batch, and her body had responded with a primal, protective instinct. Nia's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't drop the jar. She knew the sound of a sick child's cry, the desperate, hollow wail of an infant in pain, and she had seen it in the eyes of every mother on her block. Her hands shook, not from the fear of the man with the tattoos, but from the raw, unfiltered, desperate need to replace the poison he was selling with something safe. The warehouse air was thick with the scent of motor oil and cold steel, a vast cathedral of industry that Junseo Kang ruled with an iron grip. He stepped out of the shadows, the heels of his handmade Italian shoes clicking rhythmically against the concrete like a countdown. His security team stood like statues, their flashlights illuminating the trembling woman trapped against a crate of imported goods. Junseo expected to see terror, the usual wide-eyed begging of a thief caught in the lion's den, but as he drew closer, his slick black hair gleaming under the overheads, he saw something else. Nia Carter didn't look like a thief. She looked like a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, clutching her infant son, Eli, to her chest as if her own heart was beating outside her body. Her tired eyes didn't dart for an exit. They locked onto his with a searing, righteous intensity that made the dragons on his neck feel heavy. "You're Kang," she rasped, her voice a jagged blade of exhaustion and fury. She didn't wait for him to speak, didn't offer a single word of apology for the broken lock or the jar of baby food in her hand. "I've seen your face on the news, the great philanthropist, the man who brings quality and care to the neighborhood." Junseo paused, his strong jaw tightening. He was prepared to deliver a cold lecture on the price of violating his territory, his voice usually a low rumble of gravel wrapped in velvet. "You are in a private facility," he said, his obsidian eyes scanning her worn clothes and the fragile baby dressed in white. "Stealing from a man who does not believe in second chances." Nia let out a harsh, broken laugh that echoed through the rafters. "Stealing? I'm replacing you, monster!" She stepped forward, ignoring the way his guards stiffened. She thrust the jar toward him, not like an offering, but like evidence. "My neighbor's baby is in the ER. 2 more on my block can't keep water down. It's your formula, Kang, your premium brand. It's tainted, and while you're sitting in your penthouse counting your profits, the babies in my street are wasting away." The air in the warehouse seemed to drop 10 degrees. Junseo felt a sudden, sharp chill, a raw, unfiltered flash of shock that left him frozen. He looked at the jar, then back at the woman who had risked everything, not for a payday, but to save a community from the poison his own empire had unleashed. For the first time in a decade, the most feared man in the city found he had absolutely nothing to say. Junseo stood in the center of his command office, a space of glass and steel that overlooked the city he believed he owned. Yet the air felt thin, as if the walls were closing in. Nia sat on the edge of a leather sofa, her grip on Eli never wavering, her eyes tracking Junseo with a silent, burning judgment. He ignored the burning sensation of the tattoos on his neck and barked a single command into his intercom, summoning his head of logistics. When the man, a loyal lieutenant who had served the Kang family for years, entered, he didn't see the predator he expected. He saw a boss whose jaw was set like carved obsidian, holding a single jar of baby food as if it were a live grenade. "The distribution in the north sector," Junseo began, his voice dropping to a dangerous silk-covered steel. "Tell me why a mother had to break into my warehouse to find a batch that wasn't poison." The lieutenant's eyes flickered to Nia, then back to the floor, his composure fracturing under Junseo's lethal gaze. The truth spilled out in a panicked rush. To meet the aggressive quarterly margins Junseo himself had demanded, they had switched to a cheaper, unverified supplier for the base minerals. They had bypassed the safety audits, banking on the fact that the families in Nia's neighborhood were too poor to have a voice that reached the penthouse. A deafening silence filled the room, broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping baby in Nia's arms. Junseo felt a wave of raw, unfiltered nausea. For years, he had justified his violence as a necessity of the underground, a code of honor and tradition. But this wasn't honor. It was a parasitic rot growing within his own house, fueled by the very ruthlessness he had cultivated. "You cut corners on the lives of children," Junseo whispered, the lack of volume in his voice more terrifying than a shout. He turned his back on the man, his reflection in the window showing a monster he no longer recognized. He looked at Nia, this stranger who had walked into the mouth of the wolf to save children that weren't even her own. She had been right. The poison wasn't just in the jars, it was in the legacy he was building. "Get out!" he commanded the lieutenant, not even looking as the man scrambled away. Junseo turned to Nia, his obsidian eyes holding a flicker of something she hadn't seen before, a desperate, aching need for penance. "It's true," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. "And it stops tonight." The transition from the cold, industrial shadows of the warehouse to the sterile luxury of Junseo's penthouse felt like crossing into a different dimension. As the private elevator climbed toward the clouds, the silence was broken only by the soft rustle of Nia's worn jacket and Eli's tiny, rhythmic sighs. When the doors slid open, Nia stood frozen at the threshold, her eyes widening at the floor-to-ceiling glass walls that revealed a sprawling, glittering tapestry of the city below. The apartment was a monument to power, marble floors that mimicked still water and minimalist furniture that felt more like museum exhibits than things meant to be touched. Junseo watched her from the periphery, his jaw still tight with the lingering fury of the logistics office. He was a man who used space as a weapon, designed to make others feel small. But seeing Nia stand there with her tired face and protective grip on her son, the opulence suddenly felt hollow. "You'll be safe here," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate against the glass. "My men are at every entrance, the people who authorized that formula batch. They know you're a liability now." Nia didn't look impressed by the security or the view. She looked down at the pristine white rug beneath her scuffed shoes and then back at him. "Safe? Yeah, I'm in the nest of the person who started this," she whispered, though the fire in her eyes had softened into a weary flickering. "But I don't have a choice, do I? Not if I want to make sure no more babies end up like Eli almost did." As the night deepened into the quiet hours of the morning, the tension shifted into a strange, uneasy domesticity. Hunger eventually overrode the adrenaline, leading them to the high-end kitchen. Junseo, a man accustomed to 5-course meals served in silence, found himself watching in fascination as Nia bypassed the designer appliances to find a simple pot. She moved with a practiced maternal efficiency, preparing a basic meal while Eli slept in a makeshift bassinet nearby. When she eventually slid a bowl of simple, seasoned rice and vegetables toward him across the marble island, Junseo hesitated. It was a stark contrast to the complex, cold culinary displays of his world. As they ate in the glow of the city lights, the culture shock began to dissolve. Nia spoke of the neighborhood, of the families who relied on his products because they had no other options, and the weight of his legacy began to feel less like a crown and more like a cage. For a moment, the Mafia boss and the single mother weren't enemies or witnesses. They were just two people awake in the dark, bonded by the sudden, terrifying realization that they were now the only thing standing between a child and a world that didn't care if he survived. The stillness of the penthouse was shattered in the middle of the night by a sound that made Junseo's blood run cold. Not the blast of a rival's gun, but the thin, ragged wail of a child in genuine distress. He found Nia in the soft glow of the nursery light, her face a mask of raw, unfiltered panic as she cradled Eli. The baby's skin, usually a healthy, deep mahogany, was flushed with a terrifying heat, and his tiny breaths came in shallow, desperate rasps. The poison had already taken hold. "He's burning up," Nia whispered, her voice fracturing as she looked at Junseo. For the first time, the defiance was gone, replaced by a mother's primal terror. "It's the formula. Even the little he had, it's inside him." Junseo stepped forward, his obsidian eyes scanning the room for a threat he couldn't simply intimidate or crush. He was a man who commanded an empire, but as he reached out to touch Eli's forehead, his hand, scarred from years of violence, trembled. The heat radiating from the infant was a physical blow to his conscience. Without a word, he discarded his silk tie and rolled up his sleeves, revealing the ink of dragons and phoenixes that now felt like a brand of shame. They spent the night in a desperate, quiet war against the fever. Junseo moved with a silent, focused urgency he usually reserved for high-stakes negotiations, fetching cool water and damp cloths while Nia hummed a low, trembling melody to soothe the child. He watched her, exhausted and beautiful in her grief, and realized that her strength didn't come from power or weapons, but from a capacity to love that he had long ago buried beneath layers of stone. As the hours crawled toward dawn, Eli finally slumped into a fitful, shallow sleep. Junseo sat on the floor beside the bassinet, his back against the cold marble, watching the rise and fall of a life so small it could fit in the palm of his hand. He looked at his hands that had signed contracts that moved millions and ended lives, and felt a profound, humbling sense of smallness. The Mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man who realized that all his territory and wealth meant nothing if he couldn't protect a 3-month-old child from his own shadow. Nia eventually drifted off, her head resting against the edge of the crib, her hand still clutching Eli's. Junseo remained awake, a silent guardian in the dark. As the sun began to bleed over the city skyline, he made a silent vow. He would not just protect them, he would burn down the world he had built to ensure that this child and every child like him would never have to pay for the sins of the Kang name. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse, but the warmth did not reach the high-backed chairs of Junseo's private study. 3 men, elders of the syndicate with faces like weathered parchment and eyes as cold as deep-sea ice, sat across from him in a silence that weighed heavier than lead. They did not look at the city skyline. They looked at the digital reports of halted distribution lines and the rising costs of Junseo's sudden, sweeping recalls. "The council is displeased, Junseo," the eldest began, his voice a dry rasp that carried the authority of 3 generations of the Lee bloodline. "You have compromised our shipping lanes and shuttered 3 profitable subsidiaries, all for the sake of a street-level theft. And now, "Its word reaches us that you are harboring an outsider, a woman who has no place in our world." Junseo sat rigidly, his jaw clenched so tight it threatened to crack. The tattoos of dragons and phoenixes on his neck seemed to pulse with the heat of his suppressed fury. He thought of Nia's tired, protective face and the terrifying heat of Eli's fever, and the elders' talk of profit felt like a physical assault. "She is not an outsider," Junseo said, his voice dropping into a low, silk-covered steel. "She is the only person who had the courage to tell me my own house was burning from the inside. The formula was poison. My men were cutting corners on the lives of children." The second elder leaned forward, his expression severe. "In our world, the bloodline is sacred. What happens in those neighborhoods is the price of doing business. By elevating this foreign woman's concerns over the family's stability, you are betraying every tradition that built this empire." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "They are calling her a stain on the Lee name. The Park family is already whispering that you have gone soft, corrupted by a woman who is not even one of us." Junseo stood abruptly, his fluid grace masking the lethal intent radiating off him in waves. He looked down at the men who had taught him that power was the only truth, and for the first time, he felt a profound sense of disgust. "If our tradition requires the poisoning of infants to maintain its purity, then the tradition is a rot," he stated, his obsidian eyes absorbing the light. "I am not protecting a thief. I am protecting the only thing in this city that still has a conscience. But if the council sees that as a betrayal, then they should prepare themselves for what comes next." The elders rose in unison, their silence now a formal declaration of war. "You are choosing a path that leads to your own destruction, Junseo," the eldest warned. "You cannot be both a boss and a savior. Eventually, the bloodline will demand its due." As they filed out, Junseo turned back to the window, watching the reflection of a man who was already halfway through a door he could never close again. The betrayal did not come from a shadow in the alley, but from the breach of a promise Junseo thought he had secured. While he was locked in the war of words with his elders, the Park family had moved with the silent efficiency of a predator. Nia had only stepped into the hallway for a moment, at a brief lapse in the impenetrable security he had guaranteed her when the world tilted. By the time Junseo reached the nursery, the air was still, the door was ajar, and Eli was crying in his bassinet. Alone. The phone on the marble island buzzed with a rhythmic, taunting vibration. When Junseo answered, his jaw was set like carved obsidian, his eyes turning into dark, light-absorbing voids. On the other end, the voice of the Park Syndicate's underboss was slick with a poisonous satisfaction. They had Nia in a cold, fluorescent-lit basement, and they were preparing a stage. They didn't just want her dead, they wanted her broken. They were going to force a confession, recording a video where she would admit to being a corporate saboteur, claiming she had poisoned the formula herself to extort the Kang family. It was a masterstroke of cruelty designed to protect the bloodline purity the elders cherished while simultaneously dismantling Junseo's reputation. "Think about the optics, Junseo," the underboss sneered. "The hero of the people turned out to be harboring a criminal. By morning, the city will hate her, and the council will have every reason to strip you of your chair." Junseo stood in the center of his glass palace, feeling the dragons on his neck pulse with a lethal, focused heat. The setup was perfect. If Nia confessed, she would spend her life in a cage, and the tainted formula scandal would be buried under the weight of her guilt. If she refused, she would simply disappear. He looked at Eli, whose small, fragile fists were flailing against the white sheets of the bassinet. The baby was the only witness to the truth. A tiny legacy of a mother's courage. Junseo felt the last of his hesitation burn away, replaced by a raw, unfiltered fury. He didn't care about the council's approval or the optics of his empire. He cared about the woman who had dared to call him a monster and who was now being punished for his own sins. "You have 30 minutes, the underboss laughed, "before she starts talking." Junseo didn't reply. He ended the call, his fingers tracing the hand tattoos that had marked him as a dealer of death for a decade. He wasn't going to negotiate, and he wasn't going to send a team. The Parks had expected a businessman protecting his interests. They were about to meet the man who had built those interests on a mountain of bone. As he rolled up his sleeves, the Mafia boss was gone, and something far more dangerous had taken his place. The industrial basement of the Park Syndicate's headquarters was a tomb of damp concrete and humming fluorescent lights, a place where truth went to die. Junseo Kang walked through the heavy steel doors with a terrifying rhythmic calm, his custom suit a dark shadow against the grime. He was unarmed, his hands raised in a mock gesture of surrender that did nothing to hide the lethal intent radiating from his obsidian eyes. Around him, a dozen men leveled weapons at his chest, their fingers itching to pull triggers, but Junseo didn't blink. He only looked at Nia. She was strapped to a chair in the center of the room, her beautiful face bruised but her eyes still burning with that same fierce, protective light he had first seen in the warehouse. A video camera was positioned inches from her face, a silent witness to the confession they were trying to beat out of her. Seeing the mark on her cheek, Junseo felt a raw, unfiltered heat pulse through the dragons on his neck. "You're late for the show, Kang," the Park underboss sneered, stepping into the light. "The girl was just about to tell the world how you poisoned those children for profit." Junseo didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he pulled a thick, leather-bound folder from the inner pocket of his coat and tossed it onto the table between them. "I'm not here to trade bullets," he said, his voice a low rumble of gravel wrapped in velvet. "This is the final audit. Those documents contain the ledger of every cut corner, every tainted shipment, and every kickback your family took to look the other way while my men poisoned the North Sector." The underboss's smirk faltered as he flipped through the pages. It wasn't just a record of Junseo's failures, it was a roadmap of their shared corruption. If those papers were released, it wouldn't just be Junseo's chair that was stripped. It would be the entire Park bloodline that would be hunted by the other syndicates for bringing the heat of a federal investigation to their doors. "You're bluffing," the underboss hissed, though his hand trembled. "You'd destroy yourself just to take us down?" Junseo stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the smaller man. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black device, a detonator. "I've already destroyed myself," he whispered, his eyes locked on Nia. "The moment I let that formula hit the streets, I lost the right to my name, but I won't let you use her to hide your sins." He looked at Nia, a silent promise in his gaze. He had rigged the distribution hubs of both their empires to burn. He was giving them a choice: release Nia and Eli and let the truth come out on his terms, or stay and watch as everything they had built, every dollar, every tradition, and every drop of blood went up in a cleansing fire. For the first time, Junseo Kang wasn't acting as a boss. He was acting as a man who had finally found something worth more than an empire. The heavy steel doors of the basement hadn't even fully closed before the first explosion rocked the foundation, a dull roar that vibrated through the soles of Junseo's shoes. He didn't wait for the dust to settle. In one fluid, lethal motion, he closed the distance to Nia, his hands, usually so steady and cold, now moving with a desperate, frantic energy as he tore at the restraints binding her to the chair. The underboss scrambled for his weapon, but the second blast, closer this time, sent a shower of concrete dust and sparks raining from the ceiling, plunging the room into a strobe-like chaos of emergency red lights. "Eli!" Nia gasped, her voice thick with the smoke beginning to curl under the door, her fingers digging into Junseo's arms as she stood on unsteady legs. "My men have him. He's safe, Nia. I promise you," Junseo said, his voice a low, fierce growl that cut through the sirens. He shielded her body with his own as they moved toward the service exit, his obsidian eyes scanning the shadows for the Park enforcers who were now more interested in their own survival than their orders. For years, Junseo had moved through the world with a calculated, icy detachment. But as he felt Nia's heart hammering against his back, that ice finally shattered. He wasn't the obsidian boss anymore. He was a man gripped by a raw, unfiltered panic, the terrifying, beautiful fire of having something to lose. They burst into the loading bay just as the perimeter charges he had set began to detonate, lighting up the night sky in a cleansing orange glow. Gunfire erupted from the tree line, the last of the park loyalists making a desperate stand, and Junseo didn't hesitate. He thrust Nia behind the wheel of a black SUV idling near the bay, his body a living shield against the spray of glass as a bullet shattered the rear window. He felt a sharp, hot sting across his shoulder, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't. As they sped away from the burning fortress of his rivals, the dragons on his neck felt like they were finally shedding their skin. He looked over at Nia, who was reaching into the back seat where a loyal soldier handed her a sleeping, startled Eli. Seeing them together, framed by the dying embers of the empire he had built, Junseo felt a profound, humbling warmth. The man who had been frozen in a state of moral numbness for a decade was gone. In his place was someone who finally understood that power wasn't about what you could take or destroy. It was about the strength required to walk through the fire to keep someone else warm. The rain washed over the city as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, cleaning the soot and ash from the streets. Junseo stood on the private tarmac, the cold wind whipping the collar of his coat as a sleek black sedan pulled to a stop. Out stepped Han Wol, his most trusted lieutenant, a man who had always favored the quiet stability of legitimate shipping over the jagged violence of the underworld. Without a word, Junseo handed him a thick, leather-bound folder containing the keys to the kingdom, the deeds to every legitimate front, and the evidence needed to keep the council in check. It was a transition of power built not on a funeral, but on a signature. "It's yours now," Junseo said, his voice a low rumble of gravel wrapped in velvet. "Build something that doesn't require a safe room. Build something that doesn't make mothers cry in the dark." Han Wol bowed deeply, his eyes reflecting a profound respect for the man who was doing what no boss in their history had ever dared, walking away while still breathing. Junseo turned toward the plane, where Nia was already waiting at the top of the stairs. She looked different in the soft morning light. The exhaustion was still there, etched into the lines around her eyes, but the terror had been replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. She held Eli close to her chest, the baby now sleeping soundly, unaware that the world he was leaving behind had burned to ensure his future. As Junseo climbed the steps, the tattoos on his neck felt like a skin he was finally ready to shed. He was no longer the head of the Lee Syndicate. He was just a man named Junseo Kang, boarding a flight to a life where his only business was the safety of the two people watching him approach. As the plane leveled out above the Pacific, the sprawling, violent tapestry of the city disappeared beneath a blanket of white clouds. Junseo sat across from Nia, his obsidian eyes softening as he reached out to touch Eli's small, warm hand. The Mafia boss had been left on the tarmac, buried under the weight of his own redemptive fire. In his place was a protector, a partner, and a father who finally understood that a clean slate wasn't something you were given. It was something you had to fight for. "Where to first?" Nia whispered, her fingers brushing his scarred hand. Junseo looked out at the endless horizon, the sun reflecting off the wings of the plane in a blinding, hopeful gold. "Somewhere with a garden," he replied, only a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Somewhere quiet, somewhere we can just be home." The cycle of blood and tradition was broken, replaced by a family forged not by legacy, but by choice.